Welcome to week 2 of 6 of the July 2020 online class in the quality of attention. Our topic this week is attention to feeling tones. And before I begin the Dhamma talk, I would like to pay homage to the Buddha and to the Triple Gem. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang Dhammang Sanghang Namasami. As I said, our topic for this week is attention to feeling tones. And this follows directly on our topic of last week, which was attention in activity, because one thing that may begin to arise for you when you begin to focus your attention on your activities of body, speech, and mind is that you may also begin to have some reactions or some responses to what you observe when you begin to apply your attention in this way. So you may, for example, feel a lot of joy, or you may feel like celebrating if you do something that you feel good about, or you say something well, and you start to notice the response that comes up, the next thoughts and feelings and emotions that are happening. Similarly, you might have a feeling of self-criticism or judgment or even despair at observing what it is that you're actually doing and saying and thinking in ways that you perhaps hadn't been aware before. Or you might feel some frustration at even trying to do that practice and having some degree of success that perhaps is different than what you had originally expected. Similar to the young woman that I was talking about last week, getting frustrated about not being able to observe which foot went in her skirt first. So all of these kinds of responses and reactions may start to become more apparent to you. And to be clear, those things are not what we mean, what I mean by feeling tone. So feeling tone is described as one of many as one part of many different frameworks that was offered by the historical Buddha. And I hope that you'll take the opportunity, if you have the time and the interest, to have a look at the optional Dhamma talk that I posted called Wondrous Feeling, which is about that, which is about exploring the thread of practicing and feeling tone across a number of different frameworks that were offered by the Buddha. And these frameworks are also still very much in use in the Mahayana. So in particular, one I want to point to is the framework of the 5 khandhas in Pali, or 5 skandhas in Sanskrit. So they are the form, the physical form of the body itself, and then that's rupa in Pali. Vedana is feeling tone. That's what we're focused on this week. And that is the first of the 4 mental parts of the 5 skandhas. And then we have sanya, that's perception, where we identify a thing, and sankhara. So sankhara, usually understood as something like mental formations or volitional thought, intentional thought. And then vijnana, that's consciousness. Consciousness understood sometimes as a stream, or also consciousness can be understood in terms of moments of types of consciousness. So similar to the way that we now in modern day physics talk about light as being either a wave or a particle. Similarly, we can think about consciousness as being either a wave or particles. So those are the five khandhas, and feeling is the second one, Vedana, feeling tone. And it's usually described as having three settings, if you will, or three types of feeling tone. So there's pleasant, and there's unpleasant, and then somewhere in the middle there is neither pleasant nor unpleasant, is the way that it's usually described in the Pali discourses. So could be neutral, or it could be just indeterminate, like we can't really discern where it falls on the spectrum. And this spectrum is a very wide one, so it includes very, very extreme states of pleasant and unpleasant, and very foggy states as well of something in the middle. And feeling tone is an important aspect to study, in part because it is, as I said, it's one of the aspects of our mental experience that lies below the layer of actual verbalized thought. The feeling tone is something that isn't a word per se. It can often happen, um, can arise without a clear perception of what the thing is that you're having a feeling tone about. So maybe an example of this would be you see something out of the corner of your eye and it startles you because it has a negative Vedana. It has an unpleasant Vedana. There's something about it. It may turn out just to be a shadow, but the shape of the shadow or the place where it was or the fact that you couldn't see it clearly gives you a negative taste in that moment. So this is the first way of studying feeling tone, is by observing our reactions to what's happening in our everyday experience, and then relating that, sort of dialing it back, if you will, relating that to the underlying tone, looking back and saying, okay, what was the underlying tone of the contact itself? Because feeling arises at a moment of contact. And we spoke briefly about contact last week, and I'll say a little bit more about it in a few moments. But just to say, when there's some reaction, positive or negative or even neutral, maybe even like boredom, for example, is a reaction that often happens to neutral feeling tones. You can have a look at that. Have a look at that and relate it to the point at which it arose out of an interaction between the body or the mind as the sense organs, six sense organs, and something in the environment or something within the mind itself. The mind can be relating to itself. And this is also important, the framework of the six sense functions, which we'll talk quite a bit about today, I hope. But I want to share, so our primary reading today is the Salla Sutta, the Sutta of the Arrow. And it speaks very clearly, very specifically to this way that you can begin to observe your reactions and perhaps begin to work with them in a way that allows you a little bit more access to the feeling tones themselves. So I'm going to share screen for a moment and bring up that sutta. Very good. So this is sixth senses. And I want to look at the arrow. So let's do that. Very good. Salla Sutta, as described, as translated by Bhikkhu Sujato. It says right up there on the screen. So the Buddha tells his students, when an ordinary person, uneducated, ordinary person meaning uneducated about the Dhamma, somebody who hasn't had the benefit of the teachings, experiences painful physical feelings. They sorrow and lament and pine and fall into confusion. So they experience two feelings, the physical feeling itself and then a mental reaction to that. So he says it's like a person struck with an arrow only to be struck again with another arrow, a second arrow. And the point of this sutta is that the Buddha goes on to say that someone who has, and so he says here, why does the second arrow arise? It's because right here, when they are touched by painful feeling, they resist it. There's an underlying tendency for repulsion, is a very strong word that Sujato is using there, Bhante Sujato. I would say aversion or dislike, resistance against painful feeling that underlies that. So, and then it says they look forward to enjoying sensual pleasures. Very interesting. So this is a good example of this would be, for example, you have a difficult conversation with someone, and so you have unpleasant thoughts in your mind. And when you have those unpleasant thoughts in your mind, your reaction to that or your response to that is that you want to eat. And so you go and you fill, yourself up a whole pint of ice cream and sit down and eat yourself a pint of ice cream, despite the fact that that probably isn't going to make you feel very good. But that is the reaction that's happening of looking forward to a sensual pleasure as a response to a painful feeling. Okay? So then he goes on and says, I won't be able to go into complete detail about this sutta at this time. If you want to talk more about it, we can at the live discussion group. Happy to do that, or in the written discussion forum. And then he says that there is an underlying tendency toward greed for sensual pleasures, for positive feelings, pleasant sensations, pleasant feeling tone. And there is ignorance about neutral feeling tone. And so then he goes on to say, but a person who's learned the Dhamma, who's educated in the Dhamma, experience physical feelings, but they don't fall into confusion and they don't lament. So this is a pretty high bar, because if you're having some extreme pain, it's difficult to maintain a kind of steadiness of mind, a kind of clarity of mind, and an uplifted mind. But this is the bar that the Buddha is setting here for us. And his suggestion is that they only experience one feeling, the physical unpleasantness, and not the mental. So they're struck with one arrow, but then they're not struck with a second arrow. You understand? So they don't have a reaction to their feeling tone. They don't have a reaction to the unpleasantness of the feeling tone that they've experienced. So this is a kind of study in which the event has happened, the arrow has struck you, you've had some kind of a unpleasant situation happen. And then there is a reaction or a response of some kind. And you notice, so that you can work your way backwards, if you will. What I'm about to suggest is you can work your way backwards, meaning you notice that you have the second arrow. You notice that you have that feeling of confusion, or that you have that lament, that grief, that anger, any number of different types of unpleasant reactions that are happening. And you can begin to study where that came from in a literal process kind of way, in a way that is observing the attributes of mind that are connected to that. How did the anger come up? What was it associated with? What particular experience? And study that in enough detail, perhaps, to begin to notice what types of patterns are happening, what types of reactions you tend to have toward unpleasant feeling, whether it's unpleasant physical feeling or unpleasant mental feeling, like the difficult conversation that I was talking about before. And you can do the same thing for pleasant feelings and for neutral feelings. You can begin to observe what are the reactions. When you have the reactions, you can begin to say, so what's happening here? What are the different components to it? What's the mechanism involved there? And this particular aspect of the second arrow of having a reaction to one's own observation of oneself, where I started today, right? So if you begin to apply more attention to yourself in activity, and then you begin to observe your reactions to what you see, and then perhaps there are reactions to those reactions, or judgments about the fact that you're having a reaction, right? This can play itself out second, third, fourth, fifth arrow. I want to suggest that this is a moment of having great generosity for yourself. So if you took the time to look at the blog archives, the post about the gift, you saw that years ago and many, many times in the intervening periods, I recommend that, and then I recommended that when you begin to observe the gap between your ideal behavior of body, speech, or mind and your actual behavior of body, speech, or mind, it's very important to be generous with yourself, to make room for that, to be kind with that, and not to be too harsh with yourself. Because if it's too difficult to observe these things, you will simply begin to turn away. And there are lots of different ways of turning away from that gap between the ideal and the actual. One way is called spiritual bypassing. Spiritual bypassing is saying, oh no, this reaction that I'm having, this is actually a good thing. This reaction that I'm having is actually something that I'm cultivating in my practice. And I would say there are cases when we begin, when we might need to encourage ourselves to have more self-expression, but oftentimes that kind of discussion is that kind of conversation with oneself is really a form of that, of trying to bypass the hard work that needs to be done to transform our tendencies toward things that are not so skillful. I would say that kind of thinking is one of the key reasons why we sometimes see sexual abuse in Buddhist communities, and that reason why that goes on for years and years unaddressed. And that's a gross example. There are certainly other smaller examples of ways that one can personally do this kind of avoidance. And there's also just outright denial, just beginning to turn one's attention away over and over again from certain kinds of behaviors, or just not wanting to see it. Because if you're not kind to yourself about it, then it's painful to see it, and it's painful again to receive your own self-judgment. And so I want to also say, it doesn't mean that you don't try to do better, or that you don't acknowledge that there is a gap. In fact, there are very good reasons to observe the gap very clearly, and to encourage yourself to try to close it, try to address it when you find it. And in fact, the Buddha, in our optional reading today, the Buddha is described in the discourse of the analysis of the six senses as saying, be sure to see the gap, even though it is unpleasant. I want to speak a little bit about that sutta. And again, there's much more to it than what I could possibly cover today, but I will try to focus in on some things that I think will be helpful for us today. So this is again Bhante Sujato's translation of the analysis of the six sense fields. This is the Salayatana Vibhanga Sutta. So it's a fairly lengthy sutta. That's why it's in the middle length discourses, the Majjhima Nikaya. And it's number 137. And the Buddha begins by talking about the six sense bases as something that should be known or should be understood by a practitioner. So in Buddhism, there are, in addition to the usual five senses that we think about in the secular world, there's a sixth sense. So there's seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, and thinking, or you could say mental function, as the sixth sense. And this is important because the Buddha says the six classes of consciousness need to be known, should be known. The six external objects should be known. And I'm going to stop the sharing actually and come back to this for a moment, because what I want to do is talk a little bit, as I said a moment ago, about contact. So contact is when there is a sense object, a sense organ, and a consciousness, an awareness that's present. And when those three things come together, then there is a moment of I consciousness, for example, here. So this is my only, and therefore must be my favorite prop for doing Dhamma talks. And as you hopefully can see there in the video, it's a little light bulb. So the light comes together with the I and a conscious awareness of the I, and that creates a moment of I consciousness, that point of contact. And that point of contact also has then with it a feeling, and sometimes, usually, a perception and a mental formation. Okay? So there are your five khandhas, as they happen to arise when one of the six sense organs is functioning. So I also gave you an optional guided meditation this week on encounters with feeling through the six sense organs. So these things need to be known, they need to be studied. And again, the Buddha talks to us about the three kinds of feeling, and he talks about them from the perspective of the mundane life or the lay life or the sometimes the householder life is how it's referred to, or you could say it's I prefer to think of it as, again, the life of someone who isn't actively practicing with the Dhamma. And then there is what is referred to as the renunciate life, or the renunciation based forms of these experiences. So let's look at this. So this is happiness or pleasant. 6 kinds of lay happiness or lay pleasant feeling. Sights that are agreeable, pleasing with the world's material delights, when you regard it as a gain to obtain such sights, or you remember that you formerly had such sights. So that is the first kind. And then you have thoughts. So this is again the lay happiness. And then we go to renunciate happiness, or you might say a kind of happiness based on the path, on the Noble Eightfold Path. So you've understood the impermanence of sights, forms, physical forms that meet the eye, and then you truly understand with right understanding that those sights are impermanent. Suffering, or the word there, as you can see, is dukkha, right? So we talked about this before. Suffering, or simply unsatisfactory, deeply, fundamentally unsatisfactory, and perishable, likely to disappear. So now, that first one is saying that you experience pleasant feeling, pleasant Vedana, based on the just the experience of the form itself. Like getting what you wanted, like having that ice cream. Maybe it tastes good in the moment. The sweetness of the ice cream, responding somehow to the difficulty that you had in the conversation. So there's that kind of basic happiness. And then the Buddha is saying, then this renunciation-based happiness is seeing how the quality of form, or the quality of any of the 6 sense bases. So in each one of these, we're going to look at the visual and the physical forms that they see, sights, as Bhante Sujato translates it. But this is equally applying, as you see there, to smells, taste, to all the other sense functions. So you see that they are impermanent. And you might wonder, well, what's so happy about that? What is the happiness of seeing that forms or smells or tastes are fleeting? And I would propose that is a good question. That's a good koan for you. That's something to investigate for yourself this week. And I would propose that it has something to do, in my case and in many people's case, with the relief that comes from simply acknowledging the reality of it. That first step of letting go of some resistance to the fact that things are fleeting, things are impermanent. So that is the joy, or the positive Vedana of the renunciate happiness, so to speak. And then mundane kinds of sadness that it is, oops, we missed it here. And there are 6 kinds of lay sadness. Sights that are agreeable, but then sadness arises when you regard it as a loss to lose such a sight, or you recollect sights that you formerly lost, and then you feel bad about that. So an example of this is, for example, something breaks down. We at the Vihara have been having an incredible spate of things breaking down this summer. I'm not sure exactly why, but it is definitely a time of out with the old, in with the new. We have a new fridge, we have a new water heater, we have a new roof, we have many things that are new. And it is also a bit of seeing the unreliability of feeling, perhaps, that is coming up here. So in order to illustrate that, I want to tell you a story. So I'll stop the share again and we'll have a look at this again in a moment. I want to tell you a little bit of a story about when I was a young mom. So my daughter Kayla was having a birthday and I was back at work. I was a working mom, and so was her dad. Her dad was at work, and she was having a birthday, and I think it was her 3rd birthday. And so she was at daycare during the day, and I thought, great, it would be wonderful if I could throw a little party for her there with her friends at the daycare, and then we'd have another little party for family and other folks. But those are some of the kids that she spends a lot of time with, and it would be fun. So I contacted the daycare and I let them know the day that I wanted to come and have a little party for the kids and bring them all a little treat, something to eat after lunch. So that was the plan. So I left work at lunchtime and I ran over to the ice cream shop and I got each one of the children a little ice cream, a little vanilla ice cream, and some sprinkles and marshmallows and things they could put on their ice creams to make sundaes. And I thought, oh, this is going to be so much fun. So by the time I got there, they knew I was coming. So the 2 women who took care of the kids there at the daycare had the kids already seated at the table. And so, if I remember correctly, Kayla was at one end, and then there were 4 or 5 kids on either side of this long rectangular table. And then there was a little boy at the other end of the table. And this little boy was Kayla's really good friend. They were hugging buddies. They were very, very close. And so I came in with the ice creams and started setting them out right away because this is in Miami. It's hot. The things are melting. And I wanted to just go ahead and get the party started. So I set down a cup of ice cream in front of Kayla's friend. I'm sorry that I don't remember his name or the name of the 2 teachers, the 2 preschool teachers who ran this place. But in any event, I set down a cup in front of Kayla's friend, and right away the teacher came over to me and she said, oh, no, he can't have that. He's lactose intolerant. He can't have ice cream. So I took it away. And I'd already started serving the other kids. And so some of the kids were there eating ice cream. And then this little boy saw that there were kids eating ice cream and his ice cream had just gotten taken away. And he started crying, like really, really bawling. And he was really upset. And and I felt bad because he was upset and also because I hadn't really brought anything else for him. It didn't occur to me that any of the kids would not be able to eat the ice cream, so I didn't bring anything else for them to eat. So the preschool teacher came over to me and said, okay, we have these really big cookies that we usually only give the kids a piece of each day, and he loves those cookies. So why don't I'll just give him one big cookie, and that'll be a big deal, and then he'll feel better. So I said, great plan. So she goes, she gets one of the big cookies, she puts it on a special napkin, sets it in front of him, and not having any of it. The poor little guy was still so upset. He was still crying. He was not touching his cookie. He was still looking around at the other kids, including Kayla by now, who are eating their ice creams, and obviously enjoying it. And he was really bummed out. So she came to me and I said, I don't know what else to do. And she said, me either. She said, maybe one more cookie? So we said, okay, let's try that because we didn't have any other alternatives. And we felt bad seeing the little guy so upset. So she went, got another giant cookie and set it down in front of him on top of the other cookie. And then at that point, he decided, okay, he'll eat his cookie. And he stopped crying. So, whew, very happy when that moment came. So I tell this story for many because it really illustrates a lot of things about feeling tone. So one thing is the little boy, he was about Kayla's age. He was probably close to 3, maybe just over 3. He had a positive Vedana. He had a positive feeling tone about ice cream. And that flew completely in the face of the fact that obviously, apparently, according to his parents and his preschool teacher, ice cream was harmful for him. But it didn't matter in that moment. He had a positive feeling tone about it, so he had a desire for it. And he had it for a minute and then it was taken away. So that's exactly this example that the Buddha is giving, this kind of distress at losing something that has a pleasant feeling tone for you, or even the memory of losing something that had a pleasant feeling tone for you. And this is also a good example because it illustrates the fact that it doesn't really matter whether the thing is actually good for you or not. So going back to my example also of sitting there and eating a pint of ice cream in response to a difficult conversation, if you're someone who's suffering from health issues because of overeating, then that thing is obviously not helping you, yet there is some pleasant feeling associated with it still. So two things. One is the feeling tone itself is an unreliable gauge of the best way to respond to any situation. These 2 particular situations just happen to be very, perhaps, very obvious ones. But also, it's showing how we can get swept away by the feeling tone. The feeling tone arises, and if it's very strong, we can get really, really swept away by that. And then we're way down the road with some very strong reaction before we're able to have a more skillful response. So the little guy wouldn't receive the first cookie because he was so swept away. And it's, of course, it's easy to understand, right? I mean, even an adult, it might be easy to understand, certainly in a little child who may not even understand the physical dynamic that we're talking about here. So he was so swept away that even given another more skillful response, he wasn't quite able to turn himself to it yet. It wasn't until the second cookie. And it could have been that it was the second cookie, and it could have been actually that he just had a little bit more time and he kind of gave up on the idea that we might give him an ice cream. Who knows? There might be any number of factors involved there. But certainly by that point, he wasn't as swept away as he was in those initial moments. So then he was willing to receive the cookie. Willing to receive the cookie. So part of the lesson here too, which has nothing to do with this week, but I'll say it anyway because it's tangentially, this is a good time to say it. Part of the lesson here is also that our good friends can be such a big help in learning how to respond to very strong feeling tones, learning how to respond skillfully to strong feeling tones. So sorry for the pause. So we can turn to our good friends on the path, and really listen to their advice about how to respond to strong reactions to feeling tones. That can be a very helpful way of beginning to practice with feeling tone that tends to sweep us away. And we all have different experiences that lead us to have those kinds of responses. All right, going back to the sutta. So then we go on to, so that's the lay or the mundane kind of sadness. And then we have renunciate sadness. When you have understood the impermanence of sights, of forms, of smells, of tastes, you truly understand that both formally and now, all of those things are suffering and perishable, sorry. And you give rise to the yearning for supreme liberation, for freedom. You give rise to the desire for progress on the spiritual path or for insight on the spiritual path. So, oh, when will I enter and remain in the same dimension that the noble ones enter and remain in today? So that yearning, and I think, again, many of us are familiar with this kind of yearning for spiritual attainments or for maybe just more peace of mind or a little better understanding of how our minds and hearts work, or any number of different ways that we can define our aspirations, our intentions on the path. And the Buddha refers to this as a kind of renunciate unpleasant feeling. So this is the case, again, where he says, don't ignore that. Don't ignore that, actually. That's something that you need to study just as much as the other kinds of pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral feeling. And he even goes further in this sutta later on. He goes on to talk about what to do with that. And I'll get there in just a moment, but I want to keep going in order here. So this kind of sadness of having the yearning for spiritual development, for freedom, spiritual freedom, or absolute freedom, you could say, liberation, is a form of unpleasant, renunciant, or practice-based unpleasant feeling. And then there is mundane equanimity. So equanimity arises when a foolish ordinary person does not overcome their limitations and is blind to the drawbacks of forms, of things that they see with the eye. So there's been some talk about limitations. I think it would be good for us to bring this up in the discussion. But just to say, this is basically saying that when there is a seeing the form with the eye, but just being bored by the form itself, in other words, that there's no strong pleasant feeling or unpleasant feeling, there's no actual real engagement with the thing. So you're blind to the drawbacks, or you're blind to the characteristics even of the things that are seen, the sight that is seen with the eye and the thing that is smelled with the ear, and so on. So for an uneducated ordinary person, I would say, confuse equanimity with a kind of blandness or a kind of lack of engagement with the nature of the thing that they are experiencing feeling tone about. And then renunciate equanimity, or the equanimity of the path, of the practice, is when you truly understand with right understanding that the sights and feelings transcends, such equanimity transcends the sights that are impermanent, that are suffering, that are perishable. So this is really interesting. So we began early on saying that the renunciate kind of happiness, or the path happiness, was this understanding of impermanence, suffering, and perishability. But this is yet another step of an equanimity that arises out of transcending that which is experienced as impermanent, suffering, and perishable. So going beyond the form, going beyond the form. So it is a way of understanding feeling tones of any of the six, out of any kind of contact of any of the six senses, a way of understanding feeling tones as mere phenomena in the broad field of all mere phenomena. You see what I'm saying? So it's another layer. It's perhaps I could say this is the third layer of investigation of feelings. So the first one was looking at the feeling in retrospect. So you have a very strong reaction of some sort, or you have a very familiar, maybe a patterned reaction of some sort, and you kind of roll it back, dial it back, and try to understand the experience, the contact experience out of which that arose. And the second kind is looking at feeling as a driver. So seeing the gaps between the actual and the ideal, or the next step perhaps, and allowing that to drive a better understanding. So seeing the feeling tone as informational. Okay, I catch this and I see it, and then I can take that in and begin to work with it. Begin to perhaps unhook the automatic nature, the swept away nature of working with the feeling, and actually be more intentional and have a little bit more space around response to the feeling. So this is where we begin to make a distinction between reaction and response, and work toward the latter. And then, just to repeat, this third way is this renunciate equanimity, or this equanimity of the practitioner of the path, which is to see feeling tone as mere phenomena in a field of phenomena. So it's just one grain of sand on the beach. It has a function, it's related to other things, and yet there is exactly this. There's an equanimity, there's a perspective that goes beyond the self and the what's good for me or not good for me, and sees it in a way that transcends that push-pull of the feeling altogether. And so the Buddha goes on to say in this sutta, and again we won't have time for all of it, but he goes on to say that by relying on the joy of the path, the joy of being able to be present for our own reality, then we can let go of certain kinds of distress and unpleasant feeling. And he says, and you take that unpleasant feeling of aspiration for the path, and you use that actually to find this equanimity. So use it as a tool. Don't turn away from that. There's a very good, I didn't have the heart to throw another sutta at you. There's a very good sutta in the Questions of King Milinda, in which there's a whole dialogue that he has about how to use desire to transcend desire. And that's a little bit of what this is pointing at here. So I want to close with a koan, just because it completely rang a bell for me when I was reading this this analysis of the six sense functions. It says this is case 38 of the Book of Serenity, the Shoyo Roku in Japanese. The Book of Serenity is the main book of koan cases, about 100 koan cases, not about exactly 100 koan cases that are used for teaching in the Soto Zen tradition. And there's case number 38 is quoting actually the founder of a different lineage of Zen. His name is Linji, or in Japanese Rinzai. That's a different lineage of Zen than the Soto. But Rinzai was also greatly admired teacher, practitioner, insightful being. And he has a dialogue with one of his students in which he says, there is a person, I'm going to get the words right, so I'm going to read it here. There is a true person of no rank coming and going from the portals of your face. There is a true person of no rank coming and going from the portals of your face. So I leave you with that koan. I leave you with, I hope, a lot to think about in terms of feeling tone. 3 different ways of investigating feeling tone. The retrospective way, the gap or the ideal way, and the way of mere phenomena. Phenomena within a field of phenomena. I'll leave you at this point and hope to see you all for the group discussion this Sunday at 4:30 Pacific time. Be well, practice well.